Welcome back to the shop. Today I'm going to be working on two different Christmas orders for two very different knives. Both of these knives were ordered in late September, so I don't have a ton of time to work on them, but I'm going to give it my best shot. The first knife is going to be a 9.5 inch bushcraft knife. The customer gave very detailed instructions of exactly everything on the knife, so it should be pretty straightforward. He wanted the knife to be made of 80 CRV2 steel, and he wanted a symmetrical drop point, so I'm going to start by breaking down the corners of this billet to form the tip. Once that's done, I'll forge the tip to shape a little bit more before moving on to forging the handle. When breaking down a corner like this, it's important to flatten the corner pretty often or else it'll dish out and then fold over back on itself, forming a cold shut. That basically means a place where the steel has formed a little pocket by folding over itself. Cold shuts make the blade weaker, which is not something we want. At this point, the blade is about 75% forged how I want it, so I'm going to work on the finger well and the handle. I'm going to do this by using a piece of 1 1/4" 1018 round bar as a top tool. That's about the radius of the finger well, so I'm going to rough that in using that, and then file it to the dimensions that I want later. Next, I'm going to draw out the tang until it's roughly the right size. Then I'll cut it off the bar and keep forging out the tang. I'm going to use the shoulder of the anvil face to forge in a sort of bird beak at the end of the tang to help lock the hand in place. Then I'm going to forge the bevels into the blade by angling the steel against the anvil and striking at that same angle. and that'll do it for the forging. So now I take the blade over to the grinder and grind the profile and bevels to the customer's specifications. After all that's finished, I file out the finger well and add a little choil right where the blade meets the ricasso. This essentially helps distribute the stress put on the blade. Now comes the hard part. The customer wanted 2 inches of jimping, which is little grippy notches, on the spine of the blade, and he wanted the finger well to be jimped as well. So I have to file very carefully and evenly with a triangle needle file so that the jimping is all even and looks good. It took a lot of time and anxiety, but I think it turned out reasonably well. After that, I have to do some more file work. The customer asked for a rock pattern on the spine, so I have to do some random filing with my round file to make the edges jagged and rough looking. This serves no real purpose other than aesthetics, but it's a nice fun twist to put on a knife. This was only my second time doing a rock pattern, but once again, I think it turned out fairly well. The only thing left to do before the heat treat is drill holes for the pins. So I'm going to go ahead and center punch exactly where I want them so that the drill bit doesn't walk over the surface of the steel when I go to drill it. Now the blade is ready for the heat treat. The first step is to put the blade through 2 normalizing cycles. These involve letting the blade reach austenitic temperature so that the ferrite crystals inside the steel melt and the carbon dissolves into the iron. This essentially resets the grain structure of the steel, allowing all of the atoms to flow freely together. Once the blade is soaked at the austenitic temperature for a few minutes, I take it out and let it air cool so the ferrite crystals can reform in an even pattern. The purpose of these normalizing cycles is to allow the stresses inside the steel to be relieved by resetting the grain structure. Whenever you forge on steel, it breaks the crystals apart from each other and jumbles them up together. So the parts of the blade that have been forged on the most, like the tip and the finger well, have had the crystalline structure totally destroyed, leaving the steel weak. The normalizing cycles let the crystals reform so that the crystalline structure is homogeneous again and subsequently stronger. The cool thing is that you can actually see this happening. The crystals release heat as they form the chemical bonds with each other. So as the steel cools down and the crystals reform, they heat that portion of the steel up once again. It's really cool and beautiful to see. After that, I'm going to quench the blade in Park's AAA quenching oil. Cooling the steel quickly causes the crystals to form martensite instead of ferrite. In martensite, the iron crystals also contain carbon, making them very hard. After that, the last step in the heat treat is to let the blade temper at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. That allows the martensite crystals to relax into what we call bayanite, which is much more flexible. This gives the knife a good balance between hardness and toughness. With the bushcraft knife ground and heat treated, I'm going to shift my focus to the second knife now. This one is going to be a lot of fun. The customer left the design up to me. They just told me to make a long, curvy boning knife. I'm going to forge it so that it can be used as a filet knife as well if so desired. Given that this is a long, skinny knife, I'm only going to break down one corner and then I'll work from there. This blade is also 80 CRV2, so the heat treat is going to be the same as the other blade. Once the tip is broken down, I'll draw out the rest of the blade until it's long and thin. This blade is also going to have some nice graceful curves, so those will be fun to forge. Once the blade is mostly forged, I'll work in the finger well by using a piece of 3/4 inch 1095 round bar as my top tool. This finger well is going to be a little deeper than the first one with a smaller radius, so I'm using a different bar for the top tool. Then I'll use the horn of the anvil to forge the palm swell into the handle. I have to say, this is one of the funnest blade forgings I've ever done. Just like the bushcraft knife, this blade will have 2 normalizing cycles before the quench and the temper. Now, while the boning knife is in the tempering oven, I'll start working on the bushcraft knife again. I took it back to the grinder to clean all the forged scale off, but then I decided to leave the forged scale on the rock pattern on the spine because it gives it a really nice rough look that I think really complements the vibe of the piece. Then I hand sand the blade from the 80 grit belted finish all the way up to an 800 grit. But that is boring, so I am not going to show that. After all that is out of the way, I need to etch my maker's mark onto the blades through electrochemical etching with a stencil. At this point, both of the blades are essentially finished, so I'm going to move on to the handles. The boning knife is going to have a green linen micarta handle with Corby bolts, and the bushcraft knife is going to have a cocobolo wood handle with hollow pins. So I'll start by drilling the holes in each set of handle scales. Since I'm using Corby bolts on the micarta handle, I need to countersink those holes as well so that the bolt heads will fit in the holes. After all that's done, I can grind the rough profile of the handle onto the scales to remove the excess material. Micarta is literally just paper or fabric layered and bonded with epoxy, so it's really important to wear a respirator when you're working with it or else the dust will kill you. Then I'm all set to epoxy the scales onto the handle and screw up the Corby bolts. After the epoxy has set, I need to grind off the Corby bolt heads so they're flush with the scales, and then grind the scales down to the steel to get rid of any remaining excess material. For this knife, I'm not going to do any fancy contouring. I'm just going to break off the corners of the micarta and round it so it feels good in the hand. And now that all that is done, the boning knife is complete. I absolutely love how it turned out, and I hope it serves its new owner well for generations to come. Now all I need to do is finish up the bushcraft knife. Since the customer wanted a rock pattern, he asked for the scales to be inset a little bit so that the tang is visible from every angle. This means I have to shape the scales to exactly the right size and dimension before attaching them because I won't be able to work with them later without messing up the tang. So I need to draw myself some reference lines to grind to, and then I'll do some fine tuning afterwards. This is one of those things that you have to be very slow and careful with. Once the scales are at the right dimensions, I add a finger groove that the customer asked for to the front of the scales on both sides. And then I need to contour the scales completely because I won't be able to do that later. Now comes the most nerve-wracking part of this entire process. The customer asked for the blade to be acid washed. And this is stressful because I have very little control over how it turns out. I can make sure to degrease the blade and I can make sure that the acid is mixed properly, but that is about it. After that, it is all up to the acid to make the knife look good. I'll be etching in 4:1 distilled water and ferric chloride, which gives me a nice quick etch. This mason jar is not the best container to be holding this ferric chloride in because the lid is metal, and so if it splashes up, it will eventually eat through the lid. Also, since it's in a mason jar, it kind of looks like sweet tea, and I don't want anybody to drink it. Anyway, the etch went pretty well and left the blade a nice shade of dark gray. With that done, the only thing left was to attach the handle, polish it up, and then sharpen the blade. Normally, if I was using solid pins, I would just snip them off and then file them to the handle, but since these are hollow pins, if I snip them, they will crush, so I have to cut them with a hacksaw instead. Then I can file them down. I ended up polishing the Cocobolo to about 2000 grit, which really lets the natural wood grain shine through, and it turned out to be a beautiful finish. Sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to work with a customer who has an exact idea of what they want, but with this knife and this customer, the opposite was true. He was awesome to work with and his idea played out perfectly. He has good taste and he chose a beautiful wood to go with the dark, acid-washed finish of the blade. I had a blast working on these 2 Christmas orders. Christmas is always a really busy time for small business owners, especially those who manufacture all their own products, so I'm glad that I ended up having enough time to finish these 2 amidst the rush. If you're still here, I appreciate you watching this far, and I hope you have a very Merry Christmas. Until next time, stay sharp.